For our second panel, we're joined by Aoife Deary, who's the Senior Policy Officer at Citizens Advice Scotland, Sharon Egan, who's the Head of Housing Services at South Lanarkshire Council and here representing Alacho, Emma Saunders, who's the National Organiser at Living Rent, and Elaine Waterston, who is the Policy Manager for Scotland from Energy Savings Trust. And online, we're joined by Mike Callahan, who is the Policy Manager at COSLA. I welcome you all to the meeting and very much thank you for coming along this morning. So there's no need for you to operate your microphones. We'll do that for you. Please do indicate clearly. We'll try to prompt somebody when we start our questions so you know it's coming to you first. But please do indicate clearly to myself or the clerks if you want to come in. And I know, Mike, you're going to be raising your hand rather than using the chat function this morning. So I'm going to start with a number of questions around the Private Housing Rent Control Exempt Properties Scotland Regulations 2026. And I think I'll just start, Aoife, I'll just tee you up for them. So the first question is to get the sense of whether Citizens Advice Scotland agrees in principle with the proposed exemptions for mid-market rent and build-to-rent properties from the rent-controlled areas provisions. So do you agree with those exemptions? Yeah.
Thanks, Convener. Yes, actually, in development stage, we expressed some concerns about what this would mean for mid-market rent tenants, that this would effectively create a two-tier between private tenants. But we see in the regulations that care has been taken to only exempt MMR, which has been given grant funding by the Scottish Government or equivalent. So we're very keen to have this be kept under review and ensure no adverse consequences for these tenants, that they don't face large rent increases. And again, that this is kept under review. I can't comment very much on build to rent. We don't really have very much evidence on that. But I think this is just an important opportunity to remember that we are in a housing emergency. We should be doing all we can to keep everyone in the homes they have if they're suitable for them, and ensuring everyone has a safe, warm, affordable home. And rent controls are a positive contribution towards this. So we want to see them work, but we think some elements need to be kept under review.
Okay, great. Thanks. Who else would like to come in on this? Emma?
Thank you, Convener, and hi, everyone. So around mid-market rent, I think for us, what remains unclear is what's the mechanism for tenants to complain about rent increases. So just now, those are going to be the only tenants in Scotland that can't contest a rent increase. There's no provision for them to either go to the Scottish housing regulator or to go through rent adjudication. And so that's a big problem. And I think that's something that can be clarified and rectified in these regulations. And we would really encourage this to be looked at.
Okay.
I think we're also concerned because we are seeing the end of MMR contracts happening across Edinburgh and Glasgow, where housing associations have rented out buildings for 5 to 10 years towards another developer. And now these contracts are ending, and these private MMR tenants who were selected because they're on low income are seeing 50% rent increases. And so there's a lot going on in the MMR space that is not quite regulated or not quite planned for, and that we feel like there should be a bit more consideration on. And I think we think it would also be clearer if the Scottish Government published separate guidance around how they will control mid-market rents and if they're going to follow the same model as rent controls, because right now it seems like it's sort of mid-market rents are controlled by sort of the side door of rent control regulation rather than through a specific government vision. Then in terms of build to rent, we're really concerned about this exemption for several reasons. One, it's not time limited. So this is just a sort of free-for-all gift to big developers in Scotland. This will encourage our city centres, especially in sort of Glasgow, Edinburgh, Dundee, and we're already seeing that becoming unaffordable housing. Right now, Glasgow city centre is being really targeted by build-to-rent developers, pension funds, etc., to build these homes that people can't afford. So these exemptions really, we think, should be time limited. They should be a higher minimum number of homes, because otherwise we're going to see a two-tier system, and this is not going to solve the housing crisis. It's going to push up rents. And I think, I guess the last bit is, how is that interacting with the long-term future of our cities, and which housing is actually being developed in our city centres, and can we afford that?
Okay, can I just get a little bit of clarity on that? So the build-to-rent isn't time limited at the moment, so there's an exemption.
Yeah.
And you're saying that that should come to an end, and the reason you're... I'm just trying to understand that. Is that to do with the fact that we're in a housing emergency and we need to build housing, and so for a time, living rent is okay with...
Well, we don't like this exemption at all.
Right.
And 90%, 97% of respondents to your consultation didn't think they should be exempt. So we think it's a wrong exemption to have, and I think it's a sort of... present to developers who are going to extract money and wealth out of Scotland.
Okay.
However, if you can improve it, and that would be by bringing in a time exemption. So when the minister brought in that exemption at first, it was about new developments, but new developments don't stay new forever. And so at one point they should be old developments that should come into the fold. Otherwise we're going to have a two-tiered system forever, potentially.
Okay.
Does that answer your question?
I think it helps. I think I need to maybe sit with that one for a little bit longer for it to kind of drop through. But you've got it on the record. Okay. Anybody else want to come in on that question around exemptions? Sharon.
Morning, everyone. So at Alacho, we submitted our response during the consultation period in relation to the exemptions to rent control measures. So we absolutely agreed with those exemptions around mid-market rent, bringing a real option to the market for tenants. We did express some concerns around the build to rent in relation that we thought that rent control wasn't necessarily a concern in terms of the BTR, so we flagged that as part of our consultation process. However, we do recognise that these exemptions allow for more tenancies of different types and affordability to come into the market. Thank you.
Great, thanks. I'm going to... Tom, I don't know if you've put your hand up. I'm going to ask my next question, and then we can bring you in as well. So... and maybe some of you have started to touch in on this bit, but and maybe I'll ask actually my next two, I'll wrap them together. So I'd be interested to understand from, maybe I'll start with Sharon, the likely impact of the regulations on tenants and landlords, and also if you're content with the, so getting a bit granular here, if you're content with the detail of the definitions of mid-market rent and build-to-rent housing as it's proposed in the regulations.
Okay, so in terms of it bringing more, I kind of mentioned that earlier there, that it brings more options to the market in terms of affordability and for housing options, especially at this time of a housing emergency when we're seeing increased levels of homelessness. In terms of Alacho, that we absolutely agreed with the definitions for both MMR and build to rent. We thought those were purposeful, and they brought necessary safeguards for both the tenants and landlords. Thank you.
Okay, great. Who else would like to come in on impact and the definitions? Anybody? Emma?
Yeah, I think around impacts, we're quite clear that this is going to create a two-tiered system. And I think overall we were looking at the right to buy legislation, and not a legislation we really liked. However, what happened is that legislation was undermined from 2001 prior to it being ended in 2014, if I'm correct. And so we're really, really concerned that this legislation is going to be the same thing. It promises rent controls, but actually because of all the exemptions, it's actually going to destroy rent controls from the get-go. Which is what sort of the 2001 Housing Act was heralded as, like, helping right to buy, when actually it was destroying right to buy, which we're very happy it did. But I think there's parallels to learn from history just now. So we're very concerned on the impact on tenants. And I guess in terms of the details of the definition, just as I've said before, we really would like to see time limits around build to rent, and we would like to see mechanisms for tenants in build to rent and in mid-market to still contest rent increases and have access to rights around their rents.
Okay, great, thanks. Mike, you haven't had a chance to speak, and I'm sorry I called you Tom. I got so used to Tom in the previous panel. Do you want to come in on any of those questions?
Yes, thank you very much, convener. Yes, very briefly, really just want to agree with the point that Sharon said from Alacho about the definitions of mid-market rent and BTR. We think will fit for purpose, provide the necessary safeguards to ensure that scope of the exemptions, if they're allowed, are properly limited. And I think Emma was making a good point there about looking at the build to rent in respect of the time span for them. I mean, certainly though, we are in a housing emergency, and a lot of the work that was developed from the Housing Investment Task Force, which engage closely with developers, obviously need to have more housing in Scotland, but it's really how this impacts on tenants doing and affordability in our city centres. And I think the broader point as well about the whole point of rent controls is that that we're reiterating the point about councils having sufficient and satisfactory resources to ensure that they'll be practically delivered through various new systems that are required, IT admin as well as staff resources, and that councils views are fully taken on board in respect of the ongoing development of guidance on rent controls by the Scottish Government, in particular some of these elements that have been mentioned just here too. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks very much. I'm going to move on to our next area, and that is another SSI, which is Investigation Commencement of Repair, Scotland Regulations 2026, otherwise known as AWAB's Law. And I'm going to bring in Mark Griffin, who's joining us online with a number of questions. Mark, come on in.
Thanks, Convener. Good morning, everyone. Just a similar question to the previous panel, just to ask whether you agree that the broad approach taken in the regulations is proportionate and strikes the right balance between protection for tenants and the rights of landlords when it comes to the regulations being called AWAB's Law.
Aoife.
Thank you for that question. I think I'd reflect back to my answer to the first question. I think it's not so much about the balance between tenants and landlords, but whether it's enabling people to stay in safe, warm, affordable homes. And I think this regulation does go some way towards achieving that. Of course, we'll have to see how it works in practice, but we think broadly we're in agreement with it. There are some areas that maybe need looked at a wee bit more about who will enforce this, who will monitor that repairs are being started and importantly being completed, and being completed to a high standard as well, and that compensation where it's due is paid. That's an issue that we see quite frequently, especially amongst private tenants who use the tribunal. Not only is the tribunal quite a long process, quite onerous, difficult to do without advice and support, but monies are not always paid. So that is a difficult process for people to navigate, and I think the advice sector is really important within that. So to answer your question, we agree with the broad approach, but there are some details that just need worked out.
Okay, great, thanks. Anybody else? Sharon.
Yeah, so in terms of Alacho, our members are supportive of these proposed changes, and we're supportive along the lines that the specific legislation has been based in the Scottish framework, so we thought that was welcoming. We do think this targets both landlords and tenants, so in terms of landlord responsibility, but also we recognise that tenants have rights, and that we would then be addressing any issues to ensure that they're living in warm and in suitable homes. We do want to raise the point that we do recognise there is underlying issues here, potentially in terms of fuel poverty, and that should be recognised alongside the legislation that's been drafted. But just to add as well that at Alacho we have been very very welcoming, and we've been engaging with the Scottish Government around the drafting this guidance and the legislation as it gets prepared. So we've already, as you heard earlier at the panel this morning, in conjunction with the Scottish Federation of Housing Associations, ALATRO have prepared a joint document and submitted that to the Scottish Government for review. So, yeah, we are supportive of that. Thank you.
Okay. Emma.
Hi. I think we are supportive of the general principles because mould and damp has a terrible impact on tenants' health and long-term health consequences. However, we are quite concerned around how the detailed has been done. So I'll provide very specific detailed feedback just there. Right now, we think there should be a mechanism for tenants to contest or sort of report if they disagree with the landlord report or with the finished work. And that's really important because there's often a lick of paint approach where a landlord will come in and paint over the mould. It doesn't solve the structural damp issues. It means it comes back and tenants really report worsening mental health because they keep sort of reporting it and then it keeps getting worse. Lick of paint, nothing works, and it creates a spiral of disengagement and disempowerment. We think there should be a real increase in the penalties for non-compliance because right now the penalties can go up to £300 maximum, and that means that if a landlord, and this is in the social housing sector, repairs it within 1 month or 6 months, they'll face the same penalties. So that doesn't encourage speediness of repairs, and it also doesn't take into account any of the long-term health impacts. We hear that increasingly tenants are turning to no-win, no-fee lawyers, and at the moment, given that the legislation isn't giving them good compensation, we think that's quite fair enough in regards to the long-term health impacts. We think there should be a review after 6 months to ensure that the works have been effective. They should be, and then for the private rented sector, that there should be a clear definition of a competent person. Right now, this very much is at the discretion of a landlord. So a landlord could believe this person is competent, but actually, what does that make? Does that really happen in practice? And finally, and as others have raised, overall, this framework doesn't protect temporary housing tenants, which is really, really concerning because in our experiences, this, especially when they're in sort of PRS rented properties through the council, are the worst forms of housing. So people will be in for 2-3 years in temp housing with enormous mould and damp and very little recourse for repairs.
Okay, thanks very much for that. Mark, do you want to bring in your other questions?
Yeah, I just wanted to go back to the panel. Thanks, Emma, for raising the issue of temporary accommodation. We've had written concerns as well from Shelter that there won't be the same level of protection given to tenants in temporary accommodation, which is a big worry if we've got 10,500 kids in temporary accommodation just now, that they wouldn't get the same level of legal protection. I just wonder if other witnesses on the panel had similar concerns about a lack of protection for tenants in temporary accommodation.
Aoife.
Yeah, just to say we agree with that. It does seem like an omission from the regulations. We can see the regulations just applied to PRS tenants and Scottish secure tenants. But if you're on temporary accommodation, you often have a short Scottish secure tenancy or an occupancy agreement. Aware that there are other issues in that local authorities may not necessarily own all the temporary accommodation that they provide. For example, the use of B&B and hostels, that's where we see kind of the most or the worst condition issues. So, yeah, I think this really needs to be looked at.
Okay, thanks very much for that. Mark, do you have any more questions?
Yeah, thanks, Fiona. Just a couple more questions that wrap up. I know that Emma also touched on the levels of compensation, but just wanted to broadly ask whether witnesses agree that the timescales for investigating and commencing repairs and the compensation arrangements are appropriate. And secondly, just to ask if witnesses think that there should be a programme of awareness raising both for landlords and for tenants, to raise awareness of responsibilities and rights when it comes to these regulations.
Sharon.
So in terms of the timescales, within Elatro, we believe that these have been set out as being appropriate, given that clear the rights to tenants and ensuring those clear standards as well for landlords to adhere to. And Mark, I think some of that will come in terms of the work that we're doing with the Scottish Government around developing this legislation, is that there'll be clear standards and templates and guidance for landlords so that we really ensure that the sector is responding as a whole, and there's that consistency across the sector. Similarly, for tenants, ensuring that they know their rights. And I think we're, as the sector and local authorities, we're already seeing that because it's went live south of the border, and it definitely, and I can all speak here for South Lanarkshire Council, but definitely seeing more tenants coming forward when it's sort of concerns that they possibly have around damp and mould, and then us responding to that appropriately. So absolutely, I think the timescales that have been set out so far in the guidance are appropriate, and we felt that the compensation arrangement was proportionate as well. Thank you.
Okay, great. Aoife.
Yeah, just to come in on the timescales, I think this is a really important point to have laid out clearly, which it is in the regulations. Just to give some context, in Q3 of this year, we had 340 reports of damp and mould. That is to say, people coming to us for advice on damp and mould, and that's a 13% increase on last quarter. So it's a growing and significant area of housing advice for us. And most of the people who come to us for advice, it's not small amounts of damp and mould, it's extensive damp and mould that they've been living with for months, if not years, without understanding of their rights and not knowing how to get it resolved, or they've tried to get it resolved to no avail. So a lot of people are coming to us for advice on this. So I think it is really important that it is very clear what needs to be done within a certain amount of working days. I think also the inclusion of a written summary of findings is really important, because that's like a touch point for tenants and landlords to refer back to understand what the problem is, and so everyone has a shared understanding of what the problem is and what the solution needs to be. Just to touch on the programme for awareness, absolutely. I think it's really important that the Scottish Government does an extensive campaign to make both tenants and landlords aware. Previously, the Scottish Government has written to all landlords, especially during the COVID regulations, to make them aware of new rules, and that could be done again, because this is a change for the sector. It's quite a significant change, and it will require change in practice. People will want to know where to go for support and advice. Again, the role of advice of the advice sector is critical here. But yes, absolutely, there does need to be a significant programme to raise people's awareness of this ahead of it coming in, and it's coming in very soon as well, so people need to get ready for this, but also echo Sharon's comments on the development of guidance, and that is obviously going to be really helpful as well.
Okay, great. Thanks. Emma, and then Mike.
Yeah, in terms of the timescale, for us it's very much should be a maximum timescale, but we welcome it being sort of clearer, especially for private sector tenants. Before it was reasonable, which can mean anything, so we welcome that type of clarity. However, in order for those timescales to be effective, we think we really need a sort of mechanism for penalty and compensation that actually incentivises this happening. As said earlier, we don't think that the penalties in the social sector are good enough, and right now there's no penalties in the private rented sector, which means that a tenant would need to go to tribunal, get a repairing order. If that repairing order is not done, then they would need to get a rent rebate order. That could take up to 2 years, where they're exposed to mould and damp every day, which has an impact on their health, without there being any compensation or rent rebate. And I guess, for instance, just now we have a member who has a 2-month-old who's been to hospital 3 times around respiratory issues following living in mould and damp home. There is the house has been repainted now. The issue is going to re-emerge, and so that mechanism around appeal, enforcement, and ensuring that the works are well done is really, really important, we think, because otherwise there's going to be guidance. People are going to do a bit of a lick of paint, and then it's just going to move on. and the structural issues that are impacting people's health are not going to be addressed.
Okay, thanks. And Mike?
Thank you, Convener. Just agreeing with the points about timescales, they seem to be acceptable, that have been informed by our advisors, Tom Alacho. I think some other points we just say about the regulations. We're supportive and principles of the regulations that are laid. Similarly to rent controls, so for our member councils, we want to ensure for this important issue that efficient and effective systems are in place to enable work to be progressed timelessly to address these, as Emma's just underlined, there are these really important issues on damp and mould that need to be addressed. So again, with some of the startup systems for member councils, some resources will be required as part of that, as well as input from local government to the guidance. And I understand still a business impact report is still be published on this, so it'll be useful to see that when that emerges. Other important points there about temporary accommodation. Temporary accommodation is always ideally supposed to be just temporary, but I think I'm aware that the temporary accommodation standard that should be met through the SHQS, Scottish Housing Quality Standards for temporary accommodation, but it's a really important point that shouldn't be lost. Another point also is the cumulative impact on the PRS, which is an important part of the mix of housing, given the chronic shortage across various parts of the country. I think it'll be something that it could lead to some small landlords to disinvest, which will have an impact on the availability of housing stocks, which a concern for us is about people being affected from properties as a result of that. So I think there's got to be some balance and support and be aware of that issue as well for the overall housing stock that's available. But again, as I said, the point is being in a position where we can make our systems efficient and effective to respond to damp and mould for our member councils. Thank you.
Okay, great. Emma, briefly.
And sorry, just to follow up on the compensation, just now we're concerned that it mixes three things together. One is tenants having a substandard service and sort of a rent rebate type, like they should be paying less rent if their home is not watertight and sort of in good condition. 2, it's a fine for landlords not following the regulation. And 3, it should be about compensation around the health impacts of being exposed to mold and damp. And right now, it's just compensation, and we don't know if it's a fine, sort of a rent rebate, or impacts sort of remediation. And we think that a level of compensation is really inadequate.
Okay, great. Thanks very much. Okay, now we're going to move on to another topic, and my notes here say that this is for, so it's council tax regulations. And my notes here say that this will likely to engage Citizens Advice Scotland, Living Rent and COSLA. I'm going to bring in Evelyn Tweed with the initial questions in this area.
And good morning to the panel, and thanks for all your answers so far. So I'll pose this question to Aoife first, if that's okay. Do you agree in principle with the proposed regulations to give councils more flexible powers to set council tax for second and long-term empty homes?
Apologies, I'd actually let the clerk know that we don't have evidence on this.
Okay.
So afraid
You're
I
off
can't
the hook.
really.
You're off the hook. Yeah.
Afraid I can't really feed in. Apologies.
Good.
That's fine. Emma?
Yeah, we absolutely agree in principle with this. We think that's really, really important. And we've seen in Wales, where they've had the ability to raise it to up to 300%, that this has had a really positive impact, especially in rural area, touristic area, where it's brought more homes to the market, and it's made it much easier for sort of first-time buyers. So yeah, I think this is really positive and could help in areas impacted negatively by tourism.
Thanks, Emma. And Mike?
Thank you, Convener. Yes, we're supportive of this. I think it provides the sort of flexibility and empowers local authorities to use their powers appropriately locally to bring empty properties back into use, including using revenue raised to support regeneration and grants, and bringing some second homes into prime use, which is positive, particularly in the context of the housing emergency. I think local authorities around the country are really best placed to understand the local communities, the local housing pressures, and the likely impact of the sort of decisions on these type of properties, whether to introduce taxation through council tax or not, and obviously being accountable to local communities as well for the outcomes. So, yeah, as I say, we're supportive of this.
Okay, thanks, Mike. And to go on to my second question, what impact did the introduction of the power to charge a premium on second homes in 2024 have? Has this reduced the number of second homes, in your opinion? And have there been any unintended consequences? And I'll go to Emma first.
I think we don't have enough evidence in terms of like the numbers here.
Okay.
I think, and I guess it's a bit tangential to your question, but we would be really keen for this legislation to go ahead, and as well to have a review of the sort of charging of non-domestic rates for short-term let property and the sort of business relief exemption that they're having. So right now, one of the things that we are seeing is that, especially in rural areas or in hotspots like Edinburgh, increasing number of homes are being turned into short-term lets, and this has an impact on tenants. It means that it's much harder to find a permanent home to rent. And so we're really keen on some of the legislation that has been brought through by the Scottish Government to limit the number of short-term lets. And I think this piece of legislation could do a similar thing, and this would have a positive impact on the housing crisis, because it would enable more tenants to have access to homes. But in order for that to be effective, there needs to be a review of the non-domestic rates and the business rates and exemption for small businesses.
Thanks, Emma. Mike, do you have anything to come in on that one?
I don't have the actual information and evidence on the number of empty homes to inform that answer, convener. But it's a really good, useful question, and it's something that's really important for us to take on board through empty homes partnerships to reduce the number of properties across the country, and I think it really depends on some areas as well. Some areas, second homes and empty homes, it's a very low impact on the local housing system, but clearly in others, popular tourist and holiday locations, where there's a balance between particularly the second homes, which are permanently occupied by local residents, it is important. But as I say, I think we need to get the figures and information on that to inform an answer from ourselves. Thank you.
Oh, Sharon, come on in.
Sorry, apologies. I appreciate Alacho weren't coming specifically around that question, and we don't really have in terms of that specific detail, as Mike was discussing there from COSLA. But what we have discussed between members is it recognising the role that the empty homes officers have had across local authorities, and really understanding the reasons why properties are lying empty. And what we've unearthed is that there's sometimes real complex issues that's the reason that why the property is lying empty. So having that localised the full power to a local authority would allow that clear understanding around what's the complexities, what's the understanding of properties being empty, or understanding the localised issues around tourism and second homes. So I think that in terms of Alacho, we've submitted a written submission around this, and we're broadly supportive. Thanks.
Okay, great, thanks very much. So we're going to stay with council tax regulations, and I'm going to bring in Willie Coffey with a number of questions.
Thanks very much, convener. Good morning, everybody. Just in terms of the numbers, the Scottish Government estimates that we've got over 40,000 empty properties in Scotland, 32,000 of which are empty longer than 6 months, and we've got around 20,000 second homes in Scotland. So that a tally maybe about around 60,000 properties that could come back into some kind of form of use. Do you think the council tax premium proposal will help that situation or hinder it? What's your view on that? Emma, maybe you could offer a view to begin with, please.
Yeah, we think that will absolutely help bring these houses back into use, and then we think that's absolutely essential, and every incentive to bring these homes into long-term use should be used, and every government tool to do that should be used.
Thank you. Sharon, what's your own view on that? You might have heard Anna in the previous panel pleading for a discretionary element for local authorities. She cited quite a number of circumstances in the rural setting that gave the committee members an insight into the reasons that houses can be empty for long periods of time and so on. So do you think there's a need for a discretionary element there that the councils can apply to consider all the circumstances?
I think that's where the localised element would come into play. So by devolving that power to local authorities, they can make that decision because they will absolutely understand the context within their own housing market for their area. So whether that's at discretionary at different rates, then that's to be considered. But I definitely think that local authorities will know that balance in terms of what the use of second properties are for, where the empty homes are, and as I mentioned there, the complexities that often come with empty homes, or people that purchase these properties for low values over a decades of time and are no longer in the area and don't understand how that deterioration of the property is impacting the local community. The local authority will absolutely understand that. So I think in general, in terms of that power being devolved, we're supportive of that, but unclear how that will roll out across the country.
Thank you. Mike, a view from COSLA would be really welcome on this issue.
Yeah, thank you, Convener. Yes, I would agree with the points that Sharon has made from Alacho just there. Local authorities are best placed individually to understand the local pressures and likely impact of any sort of decisions in respect of particularly properties, stock, empty homes. Their position as well has been account for the local communities on the local outcomes. And for long-term empty homes in any particular community, make the case of they're obviously best placed to make those decisions and have those local discretion about whether to apply the council tax premium.
Thank you. And just finally, in the question of fairness about the whole thing behind the policy, is it fair to do this for second homeowners in particular who might have been, as you know, paying extra in any case through land and buildings transaction tax and so on and so forth? So is there a fairness debate to be had here in relation to the second home element, do you think? Emma, could you offer a view on that?
I guess for us, the key focus should be on the housing emergency and the especially in areas which have a high concentration of second homes. It's areas where people are struggling to find homes. So in the Highlands, our members speak about living in caravans, speaking about living in sort of sheds and cabins for years, sometimes with kids. Because they want to stay in their communities, because they work in the schools, because they work in the hospitals, the youth centres, etc., but cannot access long-term homes. So I think the fairness should be about really how can we support them to have access to homes.
Okay, thank you. Sharon, Mike, a view on the fairness as applied to the second homes? No view. Anything from you, Mike? Is it fair?
Well, I mean, I think it's got to go to local circumstances. We've not got an actual position on that, and it's obviously argues to for that. And maybe also my colleague from Alacho might have a view on that as well.
Okay. Many thanks to you. Thank you for that.
Okay, thanks,
Thank you.
And the last question in the council tax regs area, I'm going to bring in Fulton McGregor. Fulton.
Thanks, Convener. I think that the area that I was going to ask on has been mainly covered by Willie Coffey and Glasgow. In the interest of not just simply asking a question for the sake of it, I will pass back to yourself, Convener.
Okay, thanks very much, Fulton. And we're now going to move on to, and I would just say, Elaine, thank you for your patience this morning, because we're going to move on to this space where your contribution is very welcome. So it's the Draft Energy Efficiency Domestic Private Rented Property Scotland Regulations. And just for background, so we're all on the same page, these have not yet been laid. I think we all know that. And with that, I'm going to bring in Megan Gallagher with the first questions.
you very much, Convener. And we've been talking about draft energy efficiency regulations for quite some time. So I'm hoping to gather a little bit of an opinion this morning from the panel, whether you agree that the broad approach taken in the draft proposed regulations is proportionate and balances the rights of tenants and the rights of landlords. And Elaine, because you've been waiting so patiently, if I could come to you firstly, please.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think overall we strongly support introducing minimum energy efficiency standards in the private rented sector. And that's because the sector contains some of the least efficient homes in Scotland. So nearly half of private rented sector homes are EPC band D or below, and about 14% fall into bands E, F and G. And that poor energy efficiency is really one of the key reasons why fuel poverty rates are so high in the sector. The latest Scottish Government figures show that 41% of private rented households live in fuel poverty, and that compares to about 20% in the owner-occupied sector. So the fuel poverty rates in the private rented sector are really high. But tenants obviously have a very limited ability to influence the energy efficiency of the homes that they live in. So unlike owner-occupiers, tenants can't simply decide to improve the installation of the homes that they're living in or make other upgrades themselves. So having a standard has a really important role to play in ensuring the properties that they rent meet reasonable levels of energy efficiency. So improving the energy efficiency will obviously help cut energy demand, reduce tenant bills, which is really important because they're really high. It will make homes warmer and more comfortable, lower rates of fuel poverty, and also reduce emissions. So it's also got a role to play in terms of meeting Scotland's climate change targets and fuel poverty targets. And it will also bring health benefits to tenants by reducing their exposure to cold homes. So I think that our view would be that, yes, the proposed standards do balance the rights of tenants and landlords.
Thank you very much for that. On the subject of geography, because there's differences in terms of homes in rural areas and homes in more urban settings. So do you think there might need to be a different approach, a different engagement with landlords, particularly in those areas, to make sure that homes are made as energy efficient as they possibly can be, while recognising that some types of properties might not be able to achieve the most efficient of standards given the types of housing that they are?
I think absolutely. I mean, obviously, rates of fuel poverty are very high in lots of rural areas. But yeah, as you say, the types of homes in some of these areas are very different. It might be more challenging and more expensive to improve the energy efficiency of these properties. So I think that, you know, that in some cases exemptions will be needed in terms of costs and things like that. So yeah, absolutely, there will need to be a different approach and kind of acknowledgement of the fact that, you know, all homes in all parts of Scotland aren't the same.
That's great. Thank you very much, Elaine. I know Aoife had her hand up there, so if I can come to Aoife, thank you.
Thank you. And just to touch really quickly on your first question, we agree with the broad approach. We think it's proportionate. It's been trailed for a long time, as has been mentioned. And from our evidence, a range of harms are caused by poor energy efficiency. There's a real interconnectedness, as Elaine has mentioned, between fuel poverty, energy efficiency, poor physical and mental health. We have extensive evidence of that, which we published last year. Pardon me, in our Left in the Cold report. But just to pick up on your question about different types of geographies, if there will be different needs, I suppose, and different ways of engaging with landlords who effectively have the power to upgrade the energy efficiency of their properties. As Elena said, yes, there's a higher concentration of harder to treat properties, lower energy efficiency rated properties in these areas, but really I think it's about supporting landlords to achieve as much as they can rather than not taking any action at all, because at the end of the day there's tenants living in the properties paying high energy bills, suffering the consequences of poor energy efficiency, and this can't be allowed to continue, basically.
No, that's helpful. Thank you very much. I don't know if there's any further comments on this one. I don't know if anyone's feels that there isn't a balance. I'm sure everyone's in agreement that there is. Yes, that's great. And on my last question, in relation to the minimum energy efficiency standards and when they apply to new tenancies from 2028 with a backstop date of 2030. When should the proposals take effect, and what likely impact of any potential delay to introducing the regulatory requirements? I mean, do you think that that's do you think that it should be as soon as possible? Because that's certainly what we've heard from the previous panel. And Elaine, sorry, I'm coming back to you first, please.
I mean, I think in terms of delays, I mean, I think that the key implication of delays is that, you know, the longer it's delayed, the more tenants are missing out in terms of the benefits that these standards are designed to deliver. So without the standard, many tenants are going to continue to live in homes that are colder, more expensive to heat and less comfortable than they should be. And then that means that, you know, fuel poverty remains higher than it would otherwise be. I think there are also wider impacts as well. So without the standards, we're losing opportunities to cut energy demand and reduce emissions, which slows progress towards meeting climate change targets and also puts higher demand on gas and electricity networks. And I think that the other thing is that if landlords at the moment lack that clarity about what will eventually be required of them and by when, and that clarity is really important, so they've got that kind of certainty and lead-in time to plan and prepare. But in terms of the dates, I think we agreed with what the Scottish Government had originally proposed. No, we didn't, sorry. I think we talked about a backstop date of 2030 and then for new tenancies by 2028. But I think the longer before we have an agreement on what the standards will be and when they'll apply from, it just creates more uncertainty. And the longer it's left, landlords have less time, and they need that time to plan. They absolutely need that time to be able to plan, know what's happening. And if they're going to, for example, be doing renovations to the properties, it makes sense for them to consider energy efficiency within that as well. So yeah, that time is really, really important.
No, that's helpful, thank you. That was again something that was mentioned within the previous panel, you know, in relation to the lack of confirmed detail. And there's been a lot of goalpost moves in terms of, you know, where we began with when we started talking about this and certainly where we are now. I don't know if there's any other views that anyone wants to raise on this. Emma, yes?
So around the timescale, I also agree that as soon as possible is good, especially since right now we do there is almost better regulations in England than in Scotland, and Scotland has always been sort of leading the way in terms of housing, so it'd be nice if it continued. I think for us, and maybe less around the timescale, but if I can comment on other bits of...
Yeah, of course.
I think our concern would be about renoviction. So tenants being evicted in order for landlords to meet these targets. And so we're really keen about tenants having some protections around that. We're also concerned around how this will interact with the rent control legislation. So in terms of rent controls, there has been mention of potential exemptions around renovation, around rent controls. And so we could see tenants sort of facing very high rent increases after a renovation, which de facto leads to an eviction because they can't afford that rent increase. So we're really keen for renovations not to lead to high rent increases. We're a bit concerned about the cost cap being £10,000 rather than £15,000, especially given sort of inflation that has happened and higher sort of building costs. In order to do the renovations needed, we think 15,000 is much more appropriate. And the last bit, and sorry to bang the drum on this, is around short-term lets. Short-term lets are proving to be sort of the place where landlords go when they want to escape other regulations, whether that be around rent controls or whether that be around council tax or potentially around energy efficiency. And we think short-term lets really need to be covered by energy efficiency. Otherwise, one, it will be much harder for them to come back to the PRS at one point, and it will be even more attractive for short-term let landlords.
Certainly on the record, thank you, Emma. And Aoife, I think you had your hand up, yeah.
Thank you. Yes, just to pick up on a couple of points that Emma has made. Rent increases for energy efficiency improvements, we're really keen to see this avoided. The cost of these should not be passed along to tenants. So there needs to be a review of the schemes on offer for landlords, make sure they're fit for purpose and support landlords appropriately. And again, tenants cannot foot the bill for this are already paying, in many cases, very high energy bills because of the lack of good energy efficiency. And just about the date that this becomes effective, I think it's important to remember this is complementary to Awab's law, and knowing that that's coming in quite soon, I think it's important to try and align them as much as possible. If you improve energy efficiency, and that will deal with a lot of damp and mould issues as well. So it's about sort of tying them together and a bit of like policy coherence.
Thank you,
Okay.
Sharon.
Point is probably just to echo colleagues here in the panel and this morning around the guidance being available as early as possible. And I suppose from an electoral perspective, we're coming at it from the housing emergency and the private rented sector being a viable housing option to many. So it's just to be aware of the unintended consequences that could have in the sector, just given there's a variety of standards being placed on private landlords at the minute. I think Mike mentioned earlier just around Awab's law, around that being an impact that it'll have in the sector. So similarly, just this, it's just to be mindful. Thank you.
That's helpful. Thank you, Sharon. I think
we've still got questions in this area. So bring in Alexander Stewart. Maybe you can tuck your other bit in there, Emma. So Alexander, come on in on the same topic.
Thank you so much. We've already heard that regulations can have an impact on the sector, and that could be positive or negative. And we're already asking how that impact actually happens. So the proposed regulations may well have a negative impact, and that has been talked about by the sector when it comes to the supplier of housing, because some landlords may feel that they need to leave the market because they're not able to fulfil the regulations that come into. So there's a risk in all of this as to what the supply would be, and that could have an impact on a rural environment, maybe more so than on an urban, but would still have an impact. So if there is a risk, how should we be mitigating to manage that risk so that we don't lose the stock and the supply that's within the housing sector that we so badly need? And maybe, Sian, if you want to come first.
Yeah, I'll kick that off. So I suppose it's around the guidance being available as early as possible so that landlords can absolutely understand what their responsibility is and be able to implement things and put that in place. So, and it's around any support or communications that will come out between now and the guidance coming into place. So, but in terms of the timescales, we felt that was they were reasonable in terms of the new lets for 2028 and the picking a backstop date 2030, giving landlords time to prepare. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you.
Just to come in on that, I think what Sharon says about guidance is absolutely correct. I agree with that. I had said previously about reviewing the schemes on offer to support landlords, the advice sector, and knowing where to seek high quality advice will be really important. So an awareness campaign around this. But I think it's important to also note that, you know, the number of landlords over the last few years in Scotland has been going down, but the number of registered properties is actually going up, which you've probably heard before. So I think it's really heartening to see that more properties are coming onto the market, and maybe it's turning into more of a professionalisation of the sector, more potentially accidental landlords who find it more difficult to adhere to the rules are leaving the market, and I think that's a good thing, but it's something to keep looking at and monitoring.
Yeah, I guess for us, landlords may leave the market, but the homes never do. Like, the homes remain in Scotland, and so I guess that's why it's really interesting to tie it up with other legislation, such as council tax on empty homes, etc., that makes sure that if these homes leave the private rented sector, they might enter the sort of homeowner sector, or they will be available for other people. I think for us, a key risk that we see is more the sort of construction risk, and the technically. What we've seen in England is that the Ofgem sort of grants around Eco4 have been disastrous in terms of the impact on the building fabrics, and I think it's 92% of the works have actually damaged the properties. And so we're really, really, really keen for the retrofitting work to be done properly. And we're seeing that in terms of public retrofits just now in some council homes where they're actually trapping mould and damp by having sort of poor design and poor execution. So we'd be really interested in thinking through, like, how are they sort of accredited workers and schemes that ensure that landlords are doing the right type of work for each property.
Thank you. Eileen?
Just really to echo what others have said in terms of just the importance of making it as easy as possible for landlords to comply with any regulations that come in, and making sure that they have all of the support that they need. So there's already a lot of support for landlords in Scotland through things like the Scottish Government's Home Energy Advice Service, which provides advice and support for landlords, and also access to low-cost loans, which again is our Scottish Government funded. So I just want to say that that kind of support is going to be really important going forward if we want the standards to actually and the regulation to work in practice. And also it's important that landlords know that that support is available to them.
Okay. And my second question is about the enforcement of these regulations. Now, that's quite important that we get that right. Now, at the moment, local authorities are being earmarked for that. So it's about whether that is the suitable body to deal with it, and it would be good to get your views on that. And if that is the case, sufficient resources will require to be provided to ensure that that is effective and efficient. And across some local authorities, that may be a bigger challenge, depending on their size and their capacity and the workforce and the rurality, once again, or urban situation as to how many properties they may have to manage. Because, as we heard in the earlier, having things void is not where we want to be. But if these regulations have an effect on that and enforcement has to be dealt with and there's a knock-on effect, that could then jeopardise everything we're trying to achieve in ensuring that we have more properties and the right standard of property. And if it is enforced effectively, that's important as well. So a view on that would be quite useful from all of you, if you can. Who wants to start? Yeah, Sharon.
I think probably the importance here then is the guidance and being absolutely clear around what the guidance entails and how that's interpreted and how that rolls out operationally. So that would then impact on local authorities, and I imagine that would vary across the country in terms of people's ability or skill set or capacity to be able to carry out that enforcement role. So absolutely, as you say, resources would need to be considered and whether that comes back as funding and otherwise to create posts to do that, then that's yet to be considered. But I suppose it really just comes back to the clarity and the guidance. Thank you.
Thank you. Vic, thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. Most of our concerns around the Housing Act have been around enforcement and resources, so I'm pleased to see them being picked up, especially in this regard. I think local authorities are suitable bodies, but as you pointed out, resources will be a challenge and they have to be appropriately resourced to carry this out. We think as holders of the landlord registration, the local landlord registration systems, they're well positioned to do this, and as landlords have to register with them, it could be just a question about where is what rating are the properties that you hold, and do you have the relevant certificates. But it's a new function for local authorities, so that needs to be taken into consideration. I think there's just a point there about, well, what would this mean for landlords if they didn't comply and repeatedly didn't comply? How would any penalties be enforced? Would it be about removing from the register? So I think we need to be a bit of clarity on that.
Thank you. Anybody else?
I'm going to go to Mike first.
He's waited. Thank you, Mike. Sorry.
Convener, I welcome the question as well put there. I think, as the other members of the panel have said, underlying the need for resources for appropriate local authority enforcement, if that's deemed to be the option, would be going down with, certainly seems appropriate in some ways, given as one of the members was saying about local landlord registrations. Our position on the whole, on this principle of energy efficiency standards, we're supportive of it, but clearly, it's a point that the likes of Sharon has said from Alacho about the need for the appropriate guidance to be in place and to be set out, available as soon as possible, as well as awareness campaigns do. But overall, if you want this to work efficiently, effectively, as you said, Convener, then local authorities need to appropriately adequately resourced for.
Thank you. And Emma?
Yeah, enforcement for us is key for this to work out well. For us, it's the local authorities are best placed. However, in our experience, sort of enforcement around the landlord register, around sort of PRS enforcement in local authorities, and even around short-term landlords hasn't been as effective as it could be. So I think there's a bit of review of how that's working in practice in each local authority, and I guess it's both around having powers, but also having the culture of like, actually, we really need to do enforcement well, because having bad apples is bad for everyone, and because it has very clear consequences for tenants. I think for us that requires having stronger penalties for landlords who break the law, and really having the sort of clear stick approach, so that landlords who do well, like, are supported, and landlords who do not are penalised. Yeah.
Thank you. And Eileen?
I mean, I would agree with what others have said. Enforcement is going to be vital if the regulations are going to do what they're expected to do, and you know, we think that local authorities should obviously play a key role in regulation. I think I was just really to flag that obviously other parts of the UK, England and Wales have had regulations in place since around about 2018, so there should be a lot that could be learnt from the experience there that Scotland could draw on in terms of what works, what doesn't work, etc.
Okay, thank you, Convener.
Thanks very much. And that's the final question for this panel this morning. I think it's been a very useful discussion on those three SSIs. So thanks so much for making time to join us this morning. I'm going to now briefly suspend to allow you to leave. We now turn to agenda item 3, which is the formal consideration of two negative instruments: the Non-Domestic Rate Scotland Order 2026 SSI 2026/39 and the Non-Domestic Rate Valuation of Utilities Scotland Amendment Order 2026 SSI 2026/44. Do members have any comments on either instruments? Nobody has any comments. Is the committee agreed that we do not wish to make any further recommendations in relation to the instruments? We're agreed. Thank you. And that concludes the public part of the meeting, and we'll move into private.